Chapter 1. Trace.
"Oh, my Lord, she's taking her diaper off again."
My mother's exclamation, the third time in the past hour, sent me racing back into the living room. The luxury apartment I'd moved into 4 days ago stretched out in front of me, still a sight I hadn't quite gotten used to. Hell, I hadn't gotten used to any part of this whole situation. Not only was I in Kentucky indefinitely, I had a year lease on an apartment in Louisville. And the little girl I was suddenly responsible for? Yeah, I really hadn't gotten used to that one either. "Did she pee or anything?" I asked as I darted over to help my mom. She swatted me away as I tried to bring a new diaper her way. I'd gone from playboy bachelor to custodial guardian in the blink of an eye. 4 days ago, I didn't know how to change a diaper. Now I knew about nighttime protection and why the good diapers mattered.
"She's just uncomfortable, I guess."
Willow's little stink face as she looked up at me and my mom from the play pad in the living room made me snort with laughter. She grinned devilishly and then lifted her little dress and tore at the diaper again. "Okay, see, you need to leave that on," I told Willow. She shrieked something unintelligible and stomped away, toward a corner of toys my mother and I had quickly assembled in the day before Willow's arrival. Everything had been a disorienting whirlwind since taking sole custody of Willow, the niece I never knew I had, until my surprise half-brother went to jail and left her in my care. Personally, I didn't think that a single businessman in Manhattan was the top choice for taking custody of a 2-year-old. But if I was the best option, I sure as hell didn't want to know who my competition was.
"I think she's doing better,"
my mom said, watching as Willow tucked herself behind the Fisher-Price food truck and crossed her arms, staring out at us through the serving window. "Yeah," I said, not at all agreeing. These first few days had been rough. But then again, my entire existence had been rough for approximately the last 7 months, so something like this just seemed normal now. One more exciting addition to the shit pile that my life had become.
"Willow, do you want some lunch?"
my mom asked in that sweet grandma voice. I loved that she was here, offering to help in these vulnerable early days. She probably knew I had zero idea what to do with a 2-year-old. More than that, she knew that her sons were in a special sort of helpless disintegration. There were endless ways to describe the ramifications of having an active investigation launched by the Securities and Exchange Commission tearing apart the business I helped build from the ground up. And believe me, I'd been using every synonym available over the last 7 months, trying not to let the despair and the anxiety burrow to my bone marrow. But I had to keep my chin up and my shoulders back, all that positive bullshit people said when they weren't facing the possibility of a 10-year prison sentence and the complete destruction of their business venture and livelihood. "What about a bologna sandwich?" I offered, heading to the kitchen. I'd rented this place furnished, so all the kitchen essentials were ready and waiting for me upon move-in. All I had to do was supply the food, and copious amounts of alcohol needed to survive my new reality. I stared into the fridge. What the fuck did 2-year-olds eat? This was only the 5th entry on my list of questions that could unfurl to create a miles-long scroll. A week ago, I'd been ordering oysters on the half-shell for a pretty girl I wanted to impress at a swanky bar. Now I had a fridge stocked full of basic lunch meats that I personally hadn't eaten since I was a child myself. My, how things could change. Willow didn't answer. She didn't even react. She just kept her arms crossed over her chest and frowned at my mom. "I'll make her a sandwich anyway, just in case," I announced, pulling out the ingredients. I couldn't help feeling like this whole arrangement could have been made even slightly easier if Ian, my half-brother, could have provided me with any details or tips about suddenly raising his daughter. But he wasn't available. He was in jail awaiting trial for drug smuggling charges. Not exactly the family reunion I would have envisioned, but hey, My brief interactions with Ian back in New York had been guarded, at best. He'd never let me in on what he was really doing or why. But the drug charges illuminated everything, and it turned out he'd been scaling up to larger clients in the area. As Willow's custodial parent, he found it fitting to hand her over to me once he was taken to jail. Apparently her mother was MIA, or possibly wildly unfit. Or both.
Willow, we should play with some dolls. What do you think?
My mom's sweet, approachable demeanor never wavered, and she deserved 1,000 blessings for it. Willow was my father's granddaughter, but not my mother's. Dad had kept his affair from my mom for 24 years. Short as it had been, its consequences seemed to go on to eternity. Family drama, the gift that keeps on giving. Personally, I'd had about fucking-enough. Knock, knock, knock. The sudden banging at the door reminded me to check the time. 11:30. The social worker was right on time. I plated the plain bologna sandwich, passed it to my mom, and then hurried to open the door. An older lady with a tired smile looked in.
Hello. You must be Trace Fairchild.
She offered a hand, eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses.
I'm Bev with Social Services. I wanted to check in on little Willow and see how she's doing.
Absolutely. Please, come in. I stepped aside, gesturing for Bev to come inside. She stepped carefully, noiselessly, and her head bobbed as she looked all around, taking in the apartment.
This is a lovely place, she murmured,
bringing out her clipboard to scribble some notes. Thank you. We're still settling in, but this is home for now. I headed for Willow, gesturing to my mother. Bev, meet Deb, my mother. She's been helping out as we adjust. I laughed, though I wasn't sure who it was a bigger adjustment for, me or Willow.
Pleasure to meet you.
Bev sent the same mild smile to my mother, and then bent down to peer at Willow through the serving window of the food truck.
And you, little miss? How are you?
Willow grunted and crossed her arms. Bev nodded as I sighed. We've been getting a lot of that lately, I admitted.
I'm not surprised. For her age, it's expected. Don't take it personally. Just keep trying.
Bev offered me another crinkle-eyed smile. She asked for a place where we could chat, so I led her to the 2-story great room with big windows overlooking downtown Louisville. A gray brick fireplace stretched to the ceiling. As we sat down, I flicked on the remote that lit the fire. She smiled at me.
You seem like you have things taken care of here.
Do I? I feel pretty lost, I admitted. That might not have been the best thing to admit to a government worker who controlled whether I was fit to care for a child, and I hurried to add, I'm making it through, but this is all new to me. I'm the CFO of a wealth management company. I'm not a dad.
I understand completely. It's a big shock, especially if you weren't already in her life.
I wasn't. I only recently met my brother. He's my half-brother, actually, and My gaze swept back to my mother. Her mouth had thinned, though she focused on breaking apart the bologna sandwich. The topic of my father's other family was still raw for her. It was still raw for all of us. Ian had only popped into our lives a few months ago when he surprised Axel, Damien, and me at our office in Manhattan, claiming to be my brother. A little investigation proved the worst. He was my half-brother, which proved my father had maintained a secret family for years, though he was only involved with Ian's mother romantically for a short time. Now my parents were divorcing, Ian was in jail, and suddenly I had his daughter, my niece, in my care. Pretty much every day of my life contained a solid WTF moment.
Regardless, you're doing as well as you can,
Bev said in a reassuring tone. I'm sure she would have patted my knee if she weren't a government official. She guided me through a list of questions that she'd brought, occasionally scratching something on her sheet, or nodding for a few moments before continuing. Willow stayed in her hiding spot behind the food truck the entire time. Eventually, Mom gave up on the bologna sandwich and went to tidy the kitchen. Not like it needed tidied. This place was still sparkling from move-in day, and besides, I wasn't an anal retentive executive for nothing. I couldn't go to sleep at night with dishes in the sink. Bev eventually went back to trying to talk to Willow, asking her questions to no avail. Finally, she stood up, looked around the place, and nodded.
So you plan to stay here long term?
As long as I need to. My lawyer has told me it may take some time to finalize the custodial details, and I'll do whatever the courts require. I'd hired a lawyer almost immediately after getting the call from Kentucky Children's Services back in New York, and she'd advised me to set up a residence here until things were settled with Willow. That included figuring out long-term custody arrangements based on what happened with Ian's charges, and what backup plans could be depending on whether or not the SEC filed charges against me as well. Depending on how all that went down, Louisville could become home for a long while. Now that my brothers and I were so unstable, I had half a mind to never return to New York City. Having a Louisville outpost just made sense right now. It was my place to let the dust settle and figure out my next steps. She smiled warmly.
Any questions for me?
How the fuck am I supposed to make it through my days if I might go to prison and Willow won't eat the bologna sandwich? No. I crossed my arms, pretending to think. Only more unhelpful questions sprouted inside my head. I'll be going back to work soon, so I'll need to figure out what to do there.
Ah, yes, babysitter references.
Bev flipped through the pages of her clipboard and presented me with a sheet.
Actually, skip all the names on here and go straight to the last one. It's a private nanny agency, the best of the best in Louisville. You look like you can afford it.
She sent me a wink before she headed for the door. Thank you. I skimmed over the entries, finding the agency she'd referenced. Bev waved to Mom and said her goodbyes before letting herself out. The door snicked shut behind her.
Well, that was painless,
my mom commented as she came around the kitchen island. She reached for the sheet.
You plan on hiring one of her recommendations?
I don't see much choice. I need to get back to work ASAP, and I don't plan on asking you to become Willow's full-time grandma. My mom sent me a look, her lips pursed.
Trace, you know I would.
I know you'd do anything for me. I wrapped my arm around her in a side hug, and I appreciate that. But I'm not trying to capsize your life just because I got dealt this hand. It's my responsibility. I'll handle it. Besides, I didn't want to make my mom grapple with even more than she had on her plate recently. Finding out about her husband's infidelity beginning 25 years ago was one thing. Now all her kids were waiting to find out if they were going to prison for financial fraud. We were more fun than a barrel of fucking monkeys. She drew a deep breath and nodded, a few gray wisps escaping her thick braid down her back.
You're right, you will. There's nobody better for this than you, Trace.
Oh, come on. Not even Damien or Axel? She snorted.
I stand by what I said.
We smiled at each other as I headed back over to Willow. All right, Willow. What about some screen time? I know that motivates the youth. If you have 4 bites of bologna, I'll give you 10 minutes of Peppa Pig. She frowned up at me and didn't budge. What a negotiator. I needed to work on my skills. Okay. 20 minutes of Peppa Pig. Her hand shot out in the direction of my mom in the kitchen, which I took to mean, give me the damn plate. Mom's brows rose as she brought the plate over. I smirked, satisfied, as though I had any clue what I was doing. Maybe I have a shot at this dad thing for real, I told my mom, as Willow took a tentative bite of her sandwich. I made my way to the flat-screen TV near the fireplace, grabbing the remote.
I always thought you'd make a great daddy. Your brothers, too.
She sighed wearily, coming down to her knees in front of the food truck as Willow nibbled at her sandwich.
Just didn't imagine things playing out quite like this.
That was the understatement of the century. Willow wasn't the only thing I hadn't envisioned playing out like this. I never expected to be back in this city after I left the last time 6 years ago. Back then, I'd been traveling from New York every other week courting a big-ticket client who turned into a grade-A nightmare. But during all those visits, I'd fallen for his niece. Hook, line, and sinker. I'd been a breath away from asking her to marry me. Until she told me to fuck off, that was. I suppose these unpleasant flashbacks from my former life in Louisville were par for the course here. That meant I had no time to waste in writing a different reality, one that included no vestige of the former failure of my past. Time to get my present and future on track. I wasn't about to combine new parenthood with remote work, investing millions of dollars an hour. At least not yet. I picked up the babysitter listing again and found the number for Aurora's nannies. All right, let's see what Aurora's got for me. I dialed the number. Willow took one last bite of her sandwich and then scampered over to the couch, looking up at me expectantly. Her little face looked gaunt, like the type of face you'd expect to see peeking through a grimy window in a Charles Dickens novel. Not at all the pudgy cherub face plastered in diaper ads, which I received too many of now that my smartphone knew a toddler was in my life. I deflated a little. What had this girl lived through until now?
Aurora's nannies, how can we serve you?
The chipper, feminine voice on the other end of the phone snapped me back to reality. I cleared my throat. My name is Trace Fairchild. I'm looking for a nanny for my... I blinked, looking at Willow. Daughter. It's urgent. I'm new to the area, and I'd need a nanny as soon as tomorrow, if you can accommodate. The woman on the other end cooed, and then said,
Why, of course we can accommodate you here at Aurora's. Would you be able to come to the office? That would expedite the process, for sure. We can get your paperwork filled out, look at available nannies, and make our selection today.
Relief trickled through me. Excellent. I'll be there within a half hour. At least there was still one person in the world happy to hear from Trace Fairchild. After everything my brothers and I had been through over the last 7 months, sometimes it seemed like the entire world was against us. The active SEC investigation sure didn't help the old reputation, especially since the Fairchild brothers had been media darlings before the investigation was launched. Now our names were splattered everywhere, all the time. Less of the celebrity gossip splatter, and more of the rotten egg on the front door splatter. Mom, could you sit with Willow until I get back? I'm going to head to the nanny agency and see what I can set up. I headed to the back of the couch where she sat beside Willow, both of them seemingly entranced by the pig-like cartoon character whose head looked suspiciously like a dick and balls.
Of course, dear.
She reached up to pat my hand, not looking away from the cartoon.
I'll finish making my list of things you need, too. I remembered the newest one, those doorknob covers, so kids can't escape. Of course, it makes it pretty hard for adults, too, but we should be able to figure it out.
I smiled, squeezing her shoulder. Thanks, Mom, for everything. I meant those words more than I could properly convey. You don't have to be doing all this. I mean, I understand if it becomes too much.
What, helping take care of my ex's secret granddaughter?
She laughed bitterly.
Life never goes as planned, Trace baby. Remember that. Even when you do everything right.
I mulled her words over as I let myself out of the apartment and headed for the underground parking garage. They were both a mantra and a wound. I lived my life striving to do everything right. Not just right, but perfectly. And how was I rewarded? An estranged brother, an active SEC investigation for fraud, a fractured, crumbling empire. There had to be some way to turn this ship around, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out what the fuck it was. I slipped into my Kentucky car, my S-Class Mercedes-Benz, fully loaded, and crept toward the exit of the underground parking garage, my blinker ticking. Louisville still felt so familiar, despite the new development and hipster vibe that hadn't existed when I left town. I'd done my best to become a Louisville fixture as I courted Tatum Hendricks, which meant nearly every building I passed I'd visited at least once. As I cruised through town toward the agency, I spotted even more familiar sights, and nearly all of them were places Mercedes and I had frequented or loved 6 years ago. Mercedes. Where are you now? I tamped the thoughts before they could spiral. All that mattered now was making it through each day. 6 years ago, I'd been on the brink of asking Mercedes Hendricks to marry me. After the way she'd brutally blown me off, you'd think I'd be well on my way to never wondering about her again. In fact, at 32 years old, it was embarrassing to admit that I still wondered about an ex at all, especially when I'd had so many other women to distract me. So I told no one. I barely admitted it to myself. I didn't know how many women it would take to fully erase Mercedes from my mind, but whatever number I was at wasn't enough. It's for the best. She'd been too young then. If you'd married at age 27, everything after would have been different. My usual rationalizations hit differently back at Ground Zero. I let myself toy with the memory of Mercedes just a moment longer, but vowed to push all thoughts of her out of my mind for good once I eased into the parking lot of Aurora's Nanny's. The one-story building was a real-life version of a cutesy cartoon home, with rectangular raised beds and carefully placed paver stones leading to the front door. I pushed into the reception area, where 2 women immediately smiled at me.
Trace Fairchild.
The taller brunette swept toward me, a big grin on her face. I recognized her voice from the phone.
I am so pleased to finally meet you. I'm Denise.
I shook her hand and returned the greeting, quickly taking stock of the sparse, trendy interior design. The receptionist watched me with shy curiosity. I nodded her way as Denise, the lead placement coordinator, led me back to her office.
Let me just reiterate how much of an honor it is to have someone like you consider working with Aurora's Nannies. I follow your charitable endeavors. I'm not sure there's anyone who's done more for supporting children in need than you,
Denise said in a smooth voice as she settled behind a large wooden desk. I took a seat in front of her as she turned her computer screen so that we could both see. Why, thank you. That's touching. And it was, given how much discord I'd felt recently.
Let's get down to business. Here at Aurora's, we value transparency and high-level communication, she explained as she clicked through screens. I want to be available to you at every step of the way. Even once you receive your placement, if there's ever anything you don't like or questions you might have, I'm your go-to.
Denise's flashy grin was typical for VIP bend-over-backward service. I was used to it in Manhattan. For the right price, people would do nearly anything you asked of them. But I had no intention of abusing my status. I'd blaze through that phase after we made our first $500 million. I just wanted a damn nanny and some internal peace and quiet. Hopefully, finding the former would provide me with the latter. I appreciate that.
So tell us a little more about what you're looking for.
Denise leaned forward, her attention settling squarely on me. Well, Willow has been a bit difficult recently. I didn't know how else to describe it, and honestly, I didn't want to get into the clusterfuck of my family situation right now. It was easier to pretend she was my daughter than to rehash why I was in this position or what had preceded it. She's a little anxious around new people, but has severe anxiety with unexpected visitors. I think we need someone a bit more adept at special cases. Denise nodded, tapping at her chin.
We have a few available nannies right now that fit the bill, she explained with a conspiratorial grin, pulling up a roster of headshots on the computer screen. Each nanny had a quick summary below her portrait. You get the final call, but I'll give you a full rundown of each girl and her particular strengths and weaknesses.
As long as she knows more about kids than I do, I told her, and my knowledge is pretty much the bare minimum. Denise's tinkling laughter floated through the room.
Oh, Mr. Fairchild, we'll be providing much more than that.
She pulled up the first portfolio, a nanny named Yvonne, equestrian history, came from a large family, trilingual. Then there was Tracy, bilingual, skilled in art, certified to homeschool through 6th grade. And then there was Mercedes. Long blonde hair with highlights that sparkled in the sun like spun gold. Green eyes I'd never forgotten, couldn't forget if I tried. Excellent with special needs children and histories involving trauma. Denise's summary didn't mention the woman who cut you off 6 years ago and took the biggest piece of your heart with her. I started, but my voice failed. I wasn't sure I even had it anymore, because I suspected my bottoming-out stomach had yanked it from my throat on its way to my feet.
Mercedes is an excellent choice. She's who I would have recommended myself,
Denise purred, pulling out her phone to check something. Then she looked up at me with excitement on her face, lips pursed together like she was dying to spill a secret.
She just came back from an assignment, so you can meet her now if you'd like.